And it's all you all.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Cassaro, and I am a Technology Services Senior Consultant with Dean Dorton. And one of the things that I specialize in is Power Platform development.
And I'm Greg Petrites, Data and Collaboration Consulting Chief Architect. So I'm kind of guide, oversee all of the development across the collaboration space and data space. So this is where our team is responsible for custom application development and process automation. So that encompasses Power Platform, but it expands to Power BI, Microsoft 365, the full Microsoft 365 stack, all the way up to just custom application development.
And today we're going to be talking to you about and walking you through how you can automate a process that can take an email attachment and then save and convert that file into readily usable data in a SharePoint document library. So typically, there would be a lot of manual steps involved in this, such as checking for when the email comes in, downloading the attachment, uploading the file to SharePoint, and then reading through the PDF file to get all of the different invoice information that you want, and so on. However, using Microsoft's Power Automate and Forms Recognizer, we are able to automate this entire process so that no manual steps are required. So the main objectives that we want to cover today are, first, I'm going to demo the automated process so that you can see the starting point of the emailed invoice coming in, and then the final result of the invoice data being extracted and saved to a SharePoint library. Next, we will take a closer look at the process and follow it through to see the details of what's happening behind the scenes. And then third, Greg and I will discuss the different technologies that are used in this process, the role that each one plays, and more about how it is used. And then lastly, we will briefly discuss other options for additional automation and start thinking of ways that you can use Power Automate as a business solution. Using the two main technologies that we're going to be focusing on today, Power Automate and Azure Forms Recognizer, I was able to create a process that has these 4 high-level steps. So first, an email from Azure that contains an invoice will arrive in my Outlook inbox. Then the attached invoice PDF file will be saved to a SharePoint library that I created, used to store the different Azure invoices that I have. And then the email will be moved out of my inbox folder and placed into a separate mailbox folder. And then lastly, our process will extract data from that invoice file, and then it'll update the other SharePoint library columns that correspond to the PDF files row with that data. So you may have noticed that while explaining in the last slide, I said the second half of the process. And this is because this process is made up of 2 different Power Automate workflows, each workflow being triggered by different events. And so the first workflow is triggered when a new email arrives in my inbox. And then this also is the same workflow where Power Automate will take that email that triggers the flow, and then it'll grab the attachment from the email and save it to SharePoint. And then lastly, the flow moves the email out of my inbox, as we discussed, and into the invoices folder where I'm going to be storing all of my Azure invoice emails. And then the second half of the process, which is the second Power Automate flow, is triggered when a new file is created in the SharePoint library I created called Azure Invoices. And since this is what we just did this is what we will do in the first Power Automate flow, this second flow is triggered by the completion of the first. The workflow will fetch the newly created file from SharePoint, and then it'll send it to Forms Recognizer to extract the data that we want. And I'll go into this more later in the presentation when we look more closely at how Forms Recognizer works. But basically, before I created this process, one of the prep steps that I had to do was to create what Forms Recognizer calls a model. And what creating a model does is it teaches the tool what template or formats the data will likely be in, what data to extract, and then what data corresponds to what fields. And then next in the workflow, Forms Recognizer will return that data that we designated back to us, and then we can use that data to update the columns for our invoice PDF file in SharePoint. So now after this process is completed, we don't have to keep opening the invoice file anytime we want to reference the necessary pieces of information that we'll need to process the invoice. And something else I want to note here is with these two workflows, there is an advantage in this case in separating them into two different workflows triggered by two different things. And the advantage here is that the second workflow can now be used more flexibly because it'll not only be triggered anytime our first workflow runs, but also in the case that the Azure invoice maybe comes to me from another source. For example, maybe it was emailed to someone else and they'll then send it to me in some way. And so now I can still take that invoice file and upload it to SharePoint. And then the process of extracting and saving that data to SharePoint columns will still be automated for me. Okay, so now we're going to walk through with a demo, and I want to start the demo first with just a quick look at the starting point and then the very end result. And then after that, we'll actually step through the process in a little bit more detail. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to actually send the email right now because it does take about a minute for it to come in. But basically, this is what the email from Azure that we're talking about, this is basically what it'll look like. It'll have the subject line, which will always be the same, and then it will have a invoice PDF document attached to it. So this will arrive in my inbox, and then shortly after, you would notice that it would then be moved to my invoices folder because, as you'll see, that is part of the process. And then the end result is then over here in my Azure Invoices document library that we talked about. You can then see the PDF file is uploaded to here, and then all of the bits of information that I deemed important for quick reference are now populating the different SharePoint columns. So now we're going to walk through the process in a little bit finer detail. We are going to start over here in the first Power Automate that I kind of briefly already went over. So in general, Power Automate has what it calls connectors, and basically these are built-in integrations with other technologies. And so connectors a lot of times provide built-in triggers and actions that we can use. So this first action in any flow is called a trigger. And here you can see that I'm using an Outlook connector, and then I'm using the trigger called when a new email arrives. And then here you can see the different inputs I've provided, but you can see when a new email arrives in my inbox folder, I want this workflow to be triggered. And then here I've specified that I want to include the attachments on the email. And then I have added a subject filter so that this trigger will only fire anytime the text Azure billing is included in the subject line. And this is important because if I didn't add that, then this workflow would be firing for every email that came in, and that's obviously not something that I would want. And then the last input here that I gave is that I only want this trigger to fire when there are attachments on the email. Because even though it's unlikely, if there was a chance that an email came in from Azure and it had the normal subject line, but then no attachment, I also wouldn't want this workflow to fire since I can't do anything if there's no PDF attachment with containing an invoice on it. And then so the next action, this apply to each. We will see this action in both workflows, but basically it's a loop. And so I use this here because the attachments in the email are in array format. So in order to drill down to it, I need to use that outer action. And then here, I'm using a SharePoint connector to then create a file in SharePoint using the attachment information from the trigger. So here you can see I am creating the SharePoint file in my technology site and then in my Azure Invoices folder. And then I am using the attachments name and content that was provided to me from the trigger to then populate that file name and file content, those fields. And then once I've created that SharePoint file, then next, the last step in this first workflow is I'm going to be moving that invoice email out of my inbox and into the invoices folder like I previously described. And this step is optional. This whole workflow would still work without it, but I did this so that I can have all of my invoice emails in one spot so that later, if I want to reference them, I know where they are. And then next, before I move over to looking at the second workflow, I want to go ahead and go over to Azure Portal to talk about some of the setup that's required for Forms Recognizer, because we need to do some setup for this tool before we can then go and use it in the second Power Automate process. So in order to use Azure Forms Recognizer, you only really need to have an active Azure account. And so once you're inside of your Azure portal, this is where you can then start your setup for the tool. So one thing that you will need to do is to create a form recognizer resource, and you could also use a cognitive service multi-service resource there too. And then since I'm going to create a custom project in Forms Recognizer, instead of using one of their pre-built models, I also need to create a storage account, and then inside that storage account, an Azure Blob storage container. So I'm going to go over and look at that. You can see here the container called invoice training files. So inside this container, I uploaded my sample files, which were just previous Azure invoices. And you need to do this so that Forms Recognizer tool can have some sample files to use when it's training itself to create a custom model that we're going to be using for our extraction needs. And if there was a scenario where the file type that we were using has more than one format, that's fine and totally doable. You would just want to make sure that you upload samples of both file formats for that file type. And the more sample files that you upload, the better the accuracy of the tool will be. But as long as you have at least 5 samples of each format, then that should be good enough. And then, so now we are going to jump over to Forms Recognizer Studio. Now that we have our prerequisites complete, we are going to create and configure our project. So as you can see here, the pre-built model section, but we are going to go to custom models. And if we were creating our project right now, we would go over to create a project. And then following through this wizard, you'll enter your project details and then also select your Azure artifacts that we created in the last step over in the Azure portal. But since I already have a project created, I'm going to open that. And so this is where you can then create your model that you will be using in Forms Recognizer and Power Automate. So over here on the left-hand side, you can see there's different all the different sample files that I uploaded to the Azure Blob container. And so the first thing that you'll want to do when you get in here is to think about the different fields that you have already identified that you're going to want to extract from the document. And so once you know what fields you want to use, then you go over here and you click this Add a Field button, and then you can add all of your different fields, like you can see that I have here. And then for the sake of this demo, I'm going to go ahead and add one more field, and we'll say we want to get the account owner email. So I'll create a field called email. And then once you create the field, you can go over here to the ellipses, and then you can specify the data type for that field. And since string is correct for email, I'm going to leave that. And then the next thing that you want to do is one by one, you want to move through the different sample files, and you want to map what piece of information corresponds to what data field. And as you can see, they are color coordinated, which is kind of helpful to see what corresponds to what. And then it also has the different data displayed for each field so that you can make sure that it's pointing correctly. And I've already done most of mine, but now to do email, I will go ahead and do that for mine. So you just click on the piece of information, and then you can either enter the field in that search box, or you could go through and just click on it like that. And then once you have made your way through all of your sample documents, and again, the more that you have, the more accurate your model will be, then you can go up here and click train. And then you'll enter your model name, description, and the build mode. Mine would be template in this case. But since I've already created a model, I'm not going to do that. But after you click train, it'll start training your model behind the scenes, and then it'll notify you once it's ready. And then you will then see it over here on the models page. So here you can see the model that I created, the model ID, which we'll use in the second Power Automate flow. And then here on the test page, if you want to go ahead and test your model, you can do that here. You could select a sample file and then click Analyze. And then here it shows you using its predictions what all of the different data is from this exact file. And then it also has the confidence rate that is associated with each field. So that is creating the model. So now that we have that ready to go, we can then go over and pick back up in Power Automate and take a look at the second flow that's part of this process. So the second half of the flow, or the second half of this process, is kicked off by the first flow, which, as you recall, added the file to SharePoint. So here we can see in this trigger, there's a SharePoint trigger, and it is watching for when a file is created in that Azure Invoices folder. And then next, I'm just doing a simple initialize variable action to create a variable called columns that I'm going to use to hold my fields once I get that data later on. And here, this is just a quick call to SharePoint. Basically, I need the record ID for the file later on in the process. And since that data wasn't returned to me in the trigger, I'm going to go and fetch that here. And then here, using the built-in Forms Recognizer connector, I'm making a call over to Forms Recognizer. And you can see here my different inputs. I'm using that model ID that we saw over in the Forms Recognizer Studio previously. And then here I'm passing it my file content that came from when that file was created in the trigger. And then once we pass it over to Forms Recognizer, it'll return back then the data that I've specified. And then using another one of these apply to each to drill down into the response data from Forms Recognizer, I'll then have a fields object. So here I'm basically just making sure that the fields object is not null. It's kind of an unlikely event, but just to make sure, I'm going to do a null check. And then if it is not null, then I'm going to set that columns variable to the fields object. And then last step, similarly as in the last step, I'm going to do a null check. And as long as that columns variable is not null, then I'm going to go and using the SharePoint connector, I'm going to update that file's column values using the different data that I just received back from Forms Recognizer. And here you can also see this is where I needed that record's ID in order to do the update for that specific record. So that wraps up now the second Power Automate. So I'm going to go over to SharePoint and again look at what the final result will look like. So now we have the populated fields associated with each uploaded file. And so now we don't have to open each file to get the data we're interested in. And so when it's time to process invoices, we can use the unprocessed invoices view to see which Azure invoices are still outstanding. So now we are able to quickly reference our data, process the invoice, and then afterwards we can mark the process column as true so that it appears now in the process invoices view and our invoice data stays organized and we always know how many invoices are outstanding. Process view. All right. So now we're going to review each of the technologies used in this process and look at them closer, but also in a little bit of a more general way. The PDF file I used in this process was, of course, an Azure invoice. And here you can see the general format that these invoices follow. I've highlighted the fields that I wanted to extract in this process, but we also could have taken any other piece of information from this document too, such as we saw with the email address that we added in. You could process, or you could create a process very similar to this one with all kinds of different types of files, as long as there is a general format or formats used in that file. So a good example of this would be a W-2, since that has a very uniform format. I used a SharePoint library for this process so that each record could hold not only the PDF file, but also its associated data, so that later on, when it's time to process the invoices, I can move through the invoices much faster. So before I created the Power Automate flows, I identified what pieces of information from the PDF I would need to reference. And then I created a column in the Azure Invoices SharePoint library for each one of those data fields that I would later be extracting. And here on the slide, you can see those different fields that I identified for my process. Then I also added the process column in two views that are filtered by the process column to help me manage what invoices have been processed. SharePoint in general is a really great tool to use for a process like this that uses Power Automate, because these two technologies are coupled very closely together and they work really well together. You can do just about any of the normal SharePoint configuration and setup from a Power Automate workflow that you can do in SharePoint. So now we're going to look more closely at Forms Recognizer and what it is. Using Microsoft's definition here, Azure Form Recognizer is a cloud-based, Azure-applied AI service that uses machine learning models to extract and analyze form fields, text, and tables from your documents. So in other words, it'll analyze your forms and documents that you provide to it, extract the text and data, map fields as key value pairs, and then return that as a structured JSON output. There are both pre-built models and custom models available. You probably saw that when we were taking a look inside the Forms Recognizer Studio. Some of the pre-built models include receipts, business cards, and ID documents. And I, of course, used a custom model in this process so that I could train the model for my distinct data and use case. Since Forms Recognizer doesn't require excessive manual intervention or extensive data science expertise, it's a really great tool to use when automating data processing and applications and workflows. When it comes to development using this tool, there's numerous options that are available. Some of these include a labeling tool that's available via their layout API. You could use REST API. Using a Docker container, you can use Azure's Form Recognizer Studio. There are SDKs for C#, Python, JavaScript, or Java. So a lot of resources are supported by Form Recognizer. And Form Recognizer Studio is one of the newer resources that's been introduced with the latest version of Forms Recognizer. And it's the resource that I use in this process, as we saw, because I think it's the option that's easiest to use when integrating with Power Automate, since the Studio is housed in Azure and it has few dependencies other than the initial setup items that we created. So I'm going to turn it over to Greg now to talk more about Power Automate and Power Platform.
Yeah, so Power Automate is one part of the Power Platform architecture or Power Platform environment. I'm getting some sort of an echo. I don't know, Anna, is that you? Maybe. All right. Yep. Okay, so Power Platform is a suite of rapid application development tools that comes as part of Microsoft 365 or M365. There's various licensing requirements involved in it, but Power Platform includes Power Apps, which is for developing user interfaces. Those user interfaces could either can use any of the connectors that Anna was talking about earlier to access data in SharePoint, could communicate directly with Form Recognizer, could interact with emails. Pretty much anything in M365 you get as part of the M365 license, or you can even go into Azure SQL, Azure Storage. Some higher end cloud services can be accessed through Power Apps and expose them as a custom user interface, though there's some additional licensing that's required there. So Power Apps is for user interface development. Power Automate is for automating processes behind the scenes. And there's kind of two flavors of Power Automate. Cloud flows, which is what we're looking at here in this session, which is where things just happen behind the scenes, and as an end user, you don't see or care how it's running or where it's running. Things just happen for you. So an email arrives, the flow kicks off, and things just get processed behind the scenes. A file gets uploaded, and it calls Form Recognizer and updates columns in the SharePoint library. Desktop flows is kind of an interesting, different form for Power Automate, and that's where you have repetitive tasks that you're doing on your desktop. So maybe you get an Excel spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet has a number of, you get this spreadsheet on a regular basis. That spreadsheet has a number of rows to it. And as part of your business process, when you receive the spreadsheet, you need to, for each of those rows, you need to go over to this application and enter in these forms here, and then you need to go over here and do this data. So a lot of repetitive tasks that can only happen on your desktop. You can automate those with desktop flows. You can tell Power Automate how that process works. And then when that spreadsheet arrives, you may have to open up the spreadsheet and open up the other apps, but then you just click a button, and then Desktop Flows performs all of those tasks on your desktop that you would otherwise have to do manually. So you can kind of click a button, go get your cup of coffee, and then at the end of the process, or maybe just watch it, and then at the end of the process, all of the things that need to happen for each row has happened. Dataverse is a database which is part of the Power Platform. You can define tables and relationships and custom columns, and then and then create a user interface for that using Power Apps. If you're familiar with Dynamics 365 Sales or CRM, that is a Power App UI built on top of a Dataverse database. Now, there's a lot of work that's been done, a lot of customizations that's been done on top of it, but the foundational building blocks are the database, the Dataverse database, and the Power Apps user interface. And it's really easy to extend something like Power or like Dynamic Sales using Power Apps and Dataverse because it is just Power Apps and Dataverse. All right, toss it back to you.
I was on mute. Okay. So now for our second and last demo, I just want to quickly show you all how easy it is to get started in Power Automate. And so we are going to do that using a template in Power Automate this time. So if I go over here to Power Automate and then I go over to New Flow, under Start from a Template, I will click Template. And then this screen brings up all of the different built-in templates. You can filter them some using this up here. And so the template that I want to use is called Start an Approval in Teams when a file is added to a SharePoint folder. So I'm going to search for that. It's this first one here. So I click on it and then it gets kind of the initial setup going, and then it's going to show me the different connectors that this template uses, and then the connections associated with each connector. So since I'm already authenticated, I can just click Continue. And then here it's asking for the only inputs that it's going to need to then create this flow. So the first one is it's asking for the SharePoint site that it should monitor for when a file is added. So I'm going to say my technology SharePoint site, and then the second one is the SharePoint list that it should monitor. So this time I'm going to say I want to monitor my documents SharePoint list. And then here I could specify another subfolder that I want to monitor for new files, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to monitor my documents list as a whole. And then here, this is where I can enter the users or groups that I want to assign the approval to. So I am going to assign it to myself so that here in this process, you all can see both the requester side and the approver side. And then I will click Create. And so the flow is now created. You can see up here, it is already turned on. So now it's ready to be triggered. So I'm going to go over in SharePoint and find that documents list that I specified. And I'm going to just add a new file to it. So I'm just going to write hello, and then I will see up here that it auto saves. All right, it is saved. So I can now close out of it. And then I see here now my document file is added there. And then so it will kick off now the flow that we just created from a template. And this flow does take about 30 seconds to fire, but basically the way that you will know that it is firing in this specific case is we will see, oh, okay, that was pretty fast this time. So you can see it here in the run history. And then also you might have noticed that I now have notifications over here in Teams, as well as an email that came in about the approval. So if I go over to Teams, I see I have this notification that a system admin has sent me a request. And so it shows me the file that I attached, some information where it was added and the time, and then who requested it and then who is now approving it. So I can add a comment here and then say approve. And then it kicks that response back to the Power Automate workflow and then continues it out. So here now you can see I have another notification from the requester side saying that it is approved and the different times and who is associated with it. And then part of this built-in template also has a chat bot send me a message from Power Automate using an adaptive card. So you can kind of just see a summary here of who the request was made by, the date created, a link to the document, and then from this adaptive card, I could also have done the approval or rejection here. And then the bot also sent me an update saying that the system admin has approved the creation of this file and then any comments that were associated with it. And just to kind of show this too, part of that flow also did send me an email and it has updated that it is completed now. So to close out this presentation, I just want to mention some ways that I could have easily extended the invoice process even further. So I could have posted a message to Teams alerting someone in accounting that a new invoice had come in and is ready to be processed. I could have added a task in Planner, which is an app in Teams, and assigned that task to accounting for them to process the new invoice. Or I could have sent an email or a Teams message with maybe the number of current unprocessed invoices to a team member. With so many opportunities to use Power Automate, I encourage you all to start thinking in what ways you could use this technology to enhance your business processes. Are there manual tasks that you do every week, every month? Maybe there's a weekly email or a message that you send out that could be automated with just a couple of inputs given. Maybe you get emails containing lead information, and instead of then having to manually enter that lead information into a CRM, you'd like to automate that process. So I'd like to leave you with that thought. How could you use Power Automate?
Yeah, and Anna, I think one of the things that this demo, what you've shown us, really points out is that Automate can be used to integrate any of the M365 applications. It works well with everything in the M365 stack in order to get data in, process it, create records, update rows, all when other things happen. So it's it is the enterprise version of an if this then that type workflow technology. But with Forms Recognizer is actually Azure. So we've seen an Azure Storage and Azure Cognitive Services, and we've integrated the M365 stack, started to see how that can get integrated with custom things built in the Azure world. Forms Recognizer is just part of the cognitive services stack, which includes text analysis and sentiment analysis, where maybe you're receiving emails or monitoring a Twitter stream looking for sentiment. And if you detect things that are reflecting a negative sentiment, maybe those get added to to Planner for someone to follow up with whatever cause that has triggered that negative feedback, such that you can address that and resolve the issue to keep things to prevent bigger issues later on. cognitive services also includes image analysis. So looking for things in images and where it's not text, it's pictures and detecting faces and emotions and or analyzing samples, taking pictures of samples and using Power Automate to automate that to send over to image analysis. So it's it really is as broad as you want it to be. Yeah, I think this actually some of the things that you've shown with Forms Recognize are in the 6 months that I've been away from it. I was not aware of some of the improvements that have happened. So but the platform keeps growing, keeps getting better, and yeah. So do we have any questions? Give a moment of time.
I'm going to go ahead and mute myself just to avoid some kind of echo while we.
Actually, I'm not getting the echo now, which is strange.
Maybe it's not necessary then.
Yeah. Okay. So, Anna, thank you very much for showing us what we can do with invoices. There's our contact information. If anyone wants to reach out to either of us or any of the other presenters from any of the other sessions, please do so. We'd be happy to answer your questions offline.
Yeah, thanks, Craig, for joining me, and thank you all for joining. I hope that you found this resourceful.
Thank you, Al.
Thanks.